to Breaking to Data. We are a community of data experts and professionals who share stories and advice and industry tips, and really, share stories about data and welcome others into this community. And today I'm here with Matt Cornett. He's a VP of Analytics and Insights at Pantheon Platform. And Matt, would you share a little bit of your bio and background, just to fill people in on who you are?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. Good to be coming to you today. I am Matt Cornett, VP of Analytics and Insights at Pantheon. My role at Pantheon is to ultimately help make the company smarter by introducing data into the decision-making process, and making data and data tools and products available, throughout the organization. I've been at Pantheon for about a year now, actually a year and 2 weeks, I think. Prior to that, I was the director of data science at Transamerica. Prior to that, senior director for data science and operations at The Gap. Did a couple startups before that in early digital mortgages, early streaming music. Before that was an analytics manager at Apple, and then started out my career. It was the coolest story ever, at Freddie Mac, starting in 2001 to 2008. The entire run up to the mortgage meltdown in 2008, I had a front row seat to it. And my last role there was a senior credit risk analyst. I've literally been doing data almost my entire career, which is a lot of years now. I'm not gonna commit myself to a number at this point, but it's a lot, because I'm telling everybody I'm only 29 years old still, so I can't tell the real age of my career and still have those numbers line up.
That makes sense. Well, that's fascinating. So, what was it like, kind of starting out in Freddie Mac, all those years ago? What was that site like? What coding languages were you using? What was your day to day?
Yeah, so interesting. I love telling the story of my very first data job, because I was still an admin. My very first job at Freddie Mac was as an admin, and every Tuesday at 1 o'clock, I had to walk over to the mainframe printer, and pick up this report that printed out on legal paper. It was one report. And I had to copy it and mail it out to our account managers all over the Northeast region, and they would get it next day mail. And I'm like, well, this is the dumbest thing in the world. It's 2001. Like, this is the new world. Like, it's the millennium. I can't believe we're copying mainframe report printers. Like, it was the old mainframe report that made all this noise, the printers and everything.
Wow.
And so I started to type the numbers into a spreadsheet, and I would send the spreadsheet out by email. And I was like, well, this is dumb. Why do I need to type these numbers in? Why can't I get them from somewhere else? So I got access to this tool called MicroStrategy, where I could copy and paste the numbers into the report and then send that out. And then I'm like, well, this is dumb. Why am I doing all this copying and pasting? So I learned SQL, and then I learned SAS on top of that and completely automated it. And my career has been all downhill since then. But back in the olden days, it was a lot of SAS back then. SAS was really the commercial analytics language used by business, used by the government, and then you would interface with that either through a mainframe, sometimes a Unix server if your company was rich and lucky enough to have a really fast SAS Unix server. And then sometimes on the desktop, where you would literally, be limited to the resources that you had available on your desktop. But those were the early days, and then of course you were putting everything out in Excel or normally in paper back then. You were printing everything out and bringing it to meetings.
Wow, that's fascinating. And so you went from there to Apple, right? That was like your
Mhm.
second spot. So what was that transition like going from, Freddie Mac to Apple and all that? And also during that time must have been crazy at Apple, right?
Yeah, it was. So that again is such an interesting story. And so I think if you look at one of the themes throughout my career,
Mm.
one of the themes that I have done is, go through an open door when you see it. How did I get hooked up at Apple, I was working at Freddie Mac. I was living in DC. Specifically, I was living on Capitol Hill in DC, and I had this terrible commute home where, if you're familiar with the DC area, it was, toll road to 66 to Constitution Avenue downtown during rush hour, going across DC, going up to Capitol Hill. And doing it could sometimes take 2 to 3 hours, and it was miserable. So I applied for a part-time job at the Apple Store the night that I bought a new computer, completely forgot about it. And then 5 months later, this was May of 2007, I got a call saying, hey, do you want to come into the Apple Store for hiring event? I'm like, yeah, sure, why not? So I went in. You'll note the date. That was the month before the iPhone went on sale. And they hired me as a part-time retail store person to help hustle iPhones. In fact, fun fact, I sold one of the first 100 iPhones in the history of the world, according to like the POS data at Apple, which I later had access to be able to see that. But anyhow, I was working this part-time job. I had my full-time job at Freddie Mac. I'd leave Freddie Mac. I'd go change my clothes in my car and then go sell iPhones or Macs or whatever it was for the evening. And then just randomly, I had my technical skill. My technical skill was SaaS. I just started looking for SaaS jobs on the Apple website, and got hooked up with this guy who was starting to build an analytics team at Apple. I had some amazing experience in the retail store. I'd spent, I think a year in the retail store at that point. And this job was doing analytics for retail at Apple. So I kind of knew what was happening in the stores. I knew how to work with data. And I interviewed. I didn't get the job. I totally blew the interview. And then they came back a couple months later, like, hey, you still interested? And I moved out to California. In fact, the week that I left Freddie Mac and moved to California was the week that Freddie Mac started its government conservatorship. So like my timing was like almost impeccable. And then go out to Apple where, we're selling iPhones. iPad wasn't a real thing. Apple Watch wasn't a real thing. I think in retail, we had about 200, maybe 220 stores when I started across the world, maybe in 5 countries. I think they're up to 14 countries and many hundreds more stores at this point. Yeah. But it was such a really cool thing to do. But one of the things that I always say about data and analytics and data science is it doesn't matter what industry you're in, what you're doing. Most of the work is the same. It's 80% the same, no matter where you are, whether it's mortgages, the secondary mortgage market, or whether it is consumer retail, or whether it's streaming music. And that remainder 20% is growth. That's your opportunity to learn something new, to learn a new industry, to learn a new, stack of technical jargon, to learn anything new.
So the 20% is what changes kind of from role to role, I guess, right?
Role to role, company to company, industry to industry. Like if you look at my career, it's the secondary mortgage market, it's consumer retail, streaming music, digital mortgages, clothing, retail and e-commerce, life insurance, and now web hosting. And all of those jobs have, each preceding job has gotten me ready for the subsequent one based off of the things that I've learned. And then the fun part is all the new stuff that I pick up in each of those roles. But it's all applicable. I think about problems that I solved at Apple based off of things that I learned about credit scoring when I was at Freddie Mac. In a completely different context. And I was like, oh, this concept might help me here. Let me generalize this out. And sometimes it actually works. Oftentimes it actually works.
Yeah, very cool. Could you elaborate a little bit on that, about how like that, translated into something at Apple?
It was a long time ago, but even then, I still kind of don't want to go into the details,
Oh, yeah, no, all good.
Yeah, it's just one of those places there. I never want to go too deep into that stuff.
Yeah, makes sense. But that's cool that you're there during that time of like rapid growth and all that. But so you said that you applied and then you didn't get it, right? And then they called you. Do you have any suspicions about why they, would have called you months later? Was there something maybe you said that maybe made
Oh,
that, you know?
oh, I know exactly what it was.
Oh.
Oh yeah, no, 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 no. They were definitely pretty open. I did a really good job of talking myself um, out of a job
Mm,
because what you want to go into every interview experience thinking is how do I put myself in the best light? How do I put all of
mm,
my experience and my skills um, and baggage, quite frankly, into a package that somebody wants to buy, that somebody wants to hire. And what I didn't do in this case was I was able to show off my skills. You know, they knew, you know, that I was going to be a great data scientist and that
mhm,
I could do the job. Um, but then it's like, you know, well, why are you looking to leave? And the answer to that question should not be a laundry list of everything that you're unhappy about in your current job. And given that that was literally the first time I was kind of interviewing for a job, I really didn't know that. And I was like, well, here's all the things that makes me mad about this place. And that is a red flag to a hiring manager, as it turns
mhm,
out. And now I understand it. At the time, I didn't understand it. But you know, and this is a piece of advice that's really important when you're presenting yourself to a hiring manager. Are you presenting yourself as someone who's going to create problems for them? Or are you solving problems for them?
mhm,
In this context, I came across as someone who was going to create problems for them.
mm,
And so they ultimately passed. You know, why did they come back 2 months later? You know, I don't know. You know, struggle to find people. You know, you
mhm,
think and you reflect. I definitely do that a lot. I think about, you know, decisions that I've made, and it's like, I wonder if that was the right one. Maybe I should revisit it. And so maybe that happened. Whatever happened, you know, called and yeah, I'm like, yeah, I'm still interested. And moved out to California within a month. Came out to build a team. Was a very early member of this team, and then ultimately helped the team leader grow it. I think there were like two or three of us when I started, and 15 when I left. You know, and scaling a
wow.
team turns out to be really fun. And that's most of what I've been doing since then is building and scaling teams. And Chris and I have gone on to do great things again together, which is another, I think, really important lesson for everybody. Is that it's a small world. It's a really small world, and that means a couple different things. You know, first of all, it's a small world. Uh, when you work well with somebody, you're going to want to work well with them again in the future. And so your network is a really great place to go for future opportunities. On the flip side, it's a really small world. So you don't want to burn bridges. You don't want to make career limiting moves on things that might follow you down the road. Particularly the more senior roles you go into, the more in depth reference checking companies will do.
Mm,
Um, and sometimes people will reach out to people randomly on LinkedIn that wasn't on your list of people to check, but they'll reach out. And so, like, that's something to always keep in the back of your mind. You know, what types of relationships have you built throughout your career that are going to help or hurt you, you know, as you progress and move forward.
yeah, no, that makes sense. I know we have a lot of people probably that are, watching that are looking to break into the industry and maybe looking for their first job in data. Do you have any tips on kind of breaking into that small world and like maintaining those good relationships once you connect with different people?
Yeah, so that's again a really hard one, and I feel
Mhm,
bad for people that are kind of joining the field right now because it's really so.
mhm,
Here's where it's really hard. It's really hard to get that first job, and then it gets really hard again once you get into more senior levels because
mm,
there's so many fewer positions. But with that first job, one of the reasons it's so hard is because everybody else is trying to do it too. And everybody else is trying to do it. And you're coming into, you know, early career entry level roles without a whole lot of skills. The
mhm,
number one thing that I think would push me over the edge on a candidate in that space is me knowing that they can come in and start to work relatively independently early on. And the number one signal of that is technical skills, is the ability to code, the ability to work with data, particularly in databases. One of the things that I have found about data science and analytics, boot camps, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, elite universities, fly by night operations, they're all the same. And what they don't do is they don't teach the students how to work with data in reality. How do you get data out of a SQL database and then get data out of a different SQL base and then join it against a text file that you got from somewhere? Because that's the reality of how data science and analytics is done. Mostly through databases, mostly through incredibly filthy, dirty data that does not want to be joined together. And so you've got to force it. And in order to do that, especially at scale, you've got to have strong technical skills, particularly SQL. SQL is one of those, table stakes things. Every company that I've worked at, that I've run teams at, kind of in the commercial space, SQL has been the number one skill that everybody starts to use on day one, and uses almost every day throughout the rest of their life as a data person. I grew up programming in SAS. I know R and Python pretty well as well. Learned a little bit of Java, learned a little bit of Ruby on Rails. Like, it's all super important. The one thing as a leader that I pull on still almost every day is SQL.
Yeah, no, I was surprised by that, how much I use SQL in my current role. Like, I wasn't really expecting that. But yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, that it's really hard to kind of envision how you'd work with SQL with a large data set, or with, within that environment, if you're not, you've never done that before and you're just kind of learning, the basic commands. But do you have any tips for that, for maybe people who are in boot camps, or, who haven't like had access to, like, a large data warehouse, but want to get more comfortable working with SQL with like messy data?
Yeah, so there's always a lot of resources. The resources that I like to look at right now are the ones that are more tutorial or simulation based.
Mm.
So I think Data Quest does it really well. That's one I've seen. Data Camp is a competing product that I've heard really good things about, but I haven't seen it kind of specifically.
Mm.
Myself, so I can't endorse it personally, but I hear such amazing things about it. O'Reilly Learning has a really good interface where you can interact with SQL databases, with Spark pipelines, and kind of learn the technologies through there. But at the same time, a tool like MySQL is free. And anybody can install that on their local desktop, and load data into that, and actually start to learn the underpinnings of how a database engine works. So the table stakes with SQL are, select from, where, group by. But once you start knowing more and more about how to do it, you've got a tremendous amount of power in your hands, because you can create temporary tables that you're joining other structures against, that you're joining other things against, and you can do it all in one very efficient shot. Where if you're limited to select from, where, group by, it's going to take you many, many, many more steps, which means many, 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 many more opportunities to make a mistake, in order for you to get the same.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. We also got a question in the chat about operating systems to use SQL on. Do you have, any thoughts on that, or?
I guess I need a little bit more clarification on what that question actually means. Like, the database engines are generally running on some type of server hardware. Usually those are going to be some type of Linux-based operating system, but not always. If you're in a heavy Microsoft shop, your database servers, SQL Server is probably running on a Windows server machine, but it's usually gonna be on some type of server environment. Inside of that, there's a lot of different flavors to databases, that you'll see thrown out in job descriptions. Whether it's Snowflake, or whether it's Redshift, or BigQuery, or Teradata, or Oracle, or DB2, or any of these other things. And Again, with data science, they're mostly the same across. They have different dialects, just like, even in the United States, people speak English very differently depending on where you are in the country. And databases will speak very different SQL sometimes
Mhm.
depending on what engine you're using. It's one of those things where your skills in this space, it's a balancing act because you want them to be generic enough so that you can apply them to any company and any database that you're working on. Right now at Pantheon, we're using Snowflake. At my last company, oh gosh, we had a constellation of different database types and engines all over the place. Sometimes you'll see, the big commercial stuff in a company like Oracle or Teradata. Sometimes you'll see really cloud-based stuff. It's going to depend on that company's technological choices. You, as an
Mm.
analyst or data scientist, should be ready to interact with any types of those. And when you get the question in the interview, well, we use Snowflake, but you haven't used Snowflake on your resume. The response back is, yeah, SQL databases are the same. I haven't worked in a company that has used Snowflake before, but I will learn the specific Snowflake features. But I can operate pretty effectively on any database from day one because I know SQL strong enough that I'm able to do that.
Yeah, yeah. So there's enough transferable skill between those different databases. Yeah, that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. Yeah. So in terms of, because I know there's like different roles you probably hired for, like, data scientists, data engineers, right? Like analysts, different types of roles. What are kind of some more specific things that you look for? Like, is SQL more for data scientists and maybe other languages for engineers, or
Yeah, for sure. So SQL is one of the things that's table stakes across the board. Data analyst, data scientist, data engineer. It's going to be hard to convince me to find a space in my org for someone who doesn't know SQL.
Mm,
Beyond that, specific technical skills. When you're getting into data science or data engineer, well, let's actually take them separate.
yeah.
So data engineering, what I'm looking for, for technical skills in that space right now, it's generally going to be Python. It's going to be, probably, more advanced organizations are starting to move a lot of those workloads out to Spark. So someone in that space who has Spark experience is also going to be incredibly interesting to me. But most of the work, the bulk load of the work, is going to be done inside of Python. So Python is the number one thing that I want to see excellence in, kind of in that engineering space. With engineers, the second thing is cloud skills. How well do you know the cloud environment that you're going to be coming into in terms of the types of capabilities and the functions that you can use, but also how to set up and configure various pieces of infrastructure, and more importantly, how does it all work together,
Mm,
to come together to build an overall analytics platform. On the data science side, it's R, it's Python. It's at this point, it's really one of those two languages, and I'm looking for some type of excellence in one of those languages. Both of those languages is always better. If you hit the trifecta, include SAS in there, that's even better because a lot of these things are just generalizable between the languages. But the other thing that I look for in data scientists in particular is how well do you understand the underlying techniques that you're working on.
mm,
So for instance, when you come out of a boot camp program, you probably understand the basics of what a regression is doing.
mhm,
You can understand how to fit it. You can look at probably one or two or three diagnostics to determine your goodness of fit for the model. But that's still fairly superficial level knowledge. How do you really get in under the hood and make sure, that your data is meeting the assumptions that are required to use a regression analysis? Do you know what the assumptions are? And those types of things. So actually digging a little bit more into the mathematics and a little bit more into the theory behind the techniques because that helps me to understand whether you're able to determine when something is going wrong. A lot of us can read the material and figure out when something is going right. Yep, I've got a model here. It's got an R squared of, let's say 0.74, which, to an unsophisticated eye sounds pretty good. But to a sophisticated eye, the first question they're going to ask, okay, well, that's your R square, but what's your adjusted R square?
Mm.
And so, like, those are the types of things that I listen for to help me understand, okay, do you really know multiple regression pretty well? And can you diagnose if there's a problem and what the problem is and how to fix it? So as a data scientist, that's the type of thing that I'm looking for. The other thing that I'm looking for in a data scientist role, and it's a little bit of a softer skill. It's harder to communicate to the hiring manager. It's even more harder to fake, quite honestly.
Mm.
Um, and that's the soft skill of intellectual curiosity.
Mm.
Data scientists in my org who demonstrate curiosity just do incredibly well. And I have found like that's the number one single predictive trait that indicates to me whether someone will be successful as a data scientist or not. These strong levels of intellectual curiosity. Because sometimes in data science, you've got to dig a couple layers deeper to understand the data, to really understand the dynamics and the context of how it was put together, how to interpret it, and then ultimately, how do I transform that into a mathematical model that describes whatever phenomenon that I'm trying to predict, that I'm trying to explain, that I'm trying to analyze.
That makes sense. So, what's one way that you've seen candidates kind of present that they have that intellectual curiosity that you're looking for?
So I would say there's two ways. The one really obvious way is the questions that they ask me throughout the interview process. So if we get to the interview process and you ask me a question like something like, "What does a day today in the life of this role look like?"
Mm.
Like that is not as interesting of a question to me, as someone who's looking for curiosity, because that sounds like something you downloaded off the internet to ask
Mm.
interview questions to ask. But if you start asking me about, like, if we start talking about a data product in the interview, and I tend to do that, I tend to talk about real world things. If you start asking me questions like, oh, how does this work? What do you do with this? How did you build this model? Like, those are the types of things that get me really, really engaged as a hiring manager. I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, this person wants to know how this works, which means they have a curious brain, which means in their mind they're thinking about how to take it apart and put it back together again, which ultimately are the types of skills that I like to see.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I feel like that's a hard thing to demonstrate unless you had that experience of like knowing what questions to ask you. But that's really good to keep in mind. And
Mhm.
we have another question about hiring people with boot camp experience or STEM college degree experience. Is there one group that you usually hire more of? Are you seeing like a change over time, or any thoughts on that?
I would say it's contextual. It depends on the team and the role. So, for instance, if I'm looking for someone who's going to be more applied, so we can think of, really someone. I think I think a good example of this might be somebody in a customer analytics space,
Mm.
where we're generally using the same models, the same techniques, applying it to the same types of data, and trying to suss out insights that are specific to a set of customers or specific to a set of organizations. Those applied types of roles, I think that people with boot camp experience are incredibly well inclined to do.
Mm.
People with STEM degree experience, particularly once you get into the graduate levels, particularly at the PhD level, I like these types of candidates for more research focused things, because that's what the PhD brings you. You've got all the specific knowledge about whatever subject you studied, but then you've got, your entire academic career of learning how to research, learning how to use reference materials, learning how to take what someone has done, stand on their shoulders and take it to the next step, which is,
Mhm.
really, a key component of the scientific process. And people with advanced scientific degrees tend to do better in that space, because they're able to deal with the ambiguity of the situation, the data, and the techniques, just a whole lot better.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It's a great take. I noticed that you also have a degree as well, right, in predictive
Mhm.
analytics. I'm
Mhm.
just curious, like, what did that? Did you notice that added anything like significantly to like your experience or anything that like you really took away that if you would recommend that to people in different positions?
So I absolutely would. For me, I don't think that I'm kind of the average middle of the road case here,
Mm.
because I went and got my degrees. So like I said, my story was unique. I ended up at let me tell you how I ended up at Freddie Mac,
Yeah,
as a 20-year-old admin with blonde spiky hair and this spike in my ear. It was all kinds of
nice.
fun stuff. I looked like I was a member of NSYNC back then.
Yeah,
Um,
very cool.
and the reason I ended up there was because I got fired from Starbucks. I was working at Starbucks back in DC,
Mm.
and I got fired. I lost $20 out of my till somewhere,
Oh,
and I came in the next morning, got fired, was living in a party house with like 8 other people, needed to find a job, and I went to a temp agency, and I told them, I'm like, I know how to use a computer. I was really good at
mhm.
knowing how to use a computer. I had done a little bit of office work for my dad's company right after high school. And they placed me at Freddie Mac. There was an admin who was moving on to another role, and they needed someone to sit at her desk, and I was that temp that was going to sit there for a couple weeks. I think at the time the role paid $15 an hour, and I thought I was a millionaire making that kind of money. Like it was an immediate like double because I was making like 725 at Starbucks.
Nice.
But that's how I got there. And that was before I went to college or anything. Got the job at Apple before I'd even finished an undergraduate degree. Wasn't until I moved to California and I was here in Silicon Valley before I realized how important education was.
Mm.
So I went and got an undergraduate degree at University of San Francisco, and then I went and got my master's degree at Northwestern. The number one reason, there were two reasons that I got the master's degree. One of them was just purely personal. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college.
Mm.
So I also wanted to be the first person to have a master's degree from a university like Northwestern. And so that was one of the reasons. But the second reason was that I knew I was at the point in my career where I needed the master's degree to get through recruiters, to get through the recruiter screen.
Mm.
And so I went and got the paper for that. I had a lot of the underlying background knowledge to begin with. The one thing that I got from that degree, there was so I can't undersell it because it was absolutely the right thing to do. But I think one of the biggest things that I went back that I got out of the experience was learning the theory underlying the techniques, like actually learning the mathematics. We didn't go super deep, but I got the opportunity to do that. And then everything just made so much more sense to me because of that. And it was always the missing piece. Like I knew how to apply the techniques, but I didn't know what they meant. And now, because I know what they mean, I know their limitations. I know where I can stretch and pull and use it to solve new problems that nobody has. Where when you don't have that kind of theoretical background knowledge, you can't do that, at least not
Mm.
as efficiently or as easily.
Yeah, no, it sounds like a whole new kind of toolkit to add to problem solving, where you're able to look at things from a different perspective and all that. No, that makes sense.
Hmm.
But what's fascinating is it sounds like you learned like how to code on the job, right? Like you just
Yeah.
walked in with your spiky hair and sat down. What was that learning
Yep.
curve like?
Well, I was lucky. I was lucky because at the time I had one of the best bosses in the world,
Mm.
and I still just love her to death. Her name was Julie, and she sent me to classes. She sent me to the SAS Institute to, and anybody who has ever worked with SAS, that they are a very, very expensive company to work with. So she sent me to some not cheap trainings where I could learn it, and then there was work for me to do as soon as I got back to the office. And that's the one thing that I've learned about training classes like that is if you do them, you have to apply the skill immediately to something real, or else the knowledge
Mm.
just floats right back out of your head. You're like, oh yeah, I'll think of something to code next week, and then it's next week, and then it's next week, and then you never do it. But because I came back and I was able to apply those skills immediately, and then go take the next class, and then apply the skills and take the next class, it turns out it was incredibly easy for me to learn. So the lesson for everybody here is um, when you need training, ask for it and ask for something specific. Don't go to your manager and say, I need training, because that's not a statement that we can do anything with. If you come to me and say, I would like to go to this class on this date and it's this much, that's something that a manager can do something with. Hopefully your manager will have a training budget that they can apply to that. If not, there's other tools and techniques, and it varies from organization to organization. But there's other levers that managers can pull to help get you those skills, because ultimately it benefits me. Me helping you get skills benefits me as the manager in the long run. And so be specific and ask for it. Don't assume that I know what you want or need, because I don't. Managers aren't mind readers. We do our best. I think that I've been lucky that I've always had great managers that I've felt like have had my best interest at heart. I try and do the same for my people. So make sure that you have that training and development conversation with your managers.
Yeah, no,
Um,
that's a really good tip. That makes sense. We also had a question on areas of math that you recommend that people learn besides like statistics, because you're talking about how like that really added a valuable perspective in terms of higher level viewing of these issues.
mhm. Yep. Linear algebra is definitely an area. If data science is your interest, linear algebra is an area that I would recommend spending time in. It's going to help you with optimization problems, and we have a lot of optimization problems, especially the more mature your organization gets. They move from descriptive analytics to predictive analytics, not prescriptive. Descriptive to predictive to prescriptive, and
Mm.
prescriptive analytics is where that linear algebra really starts to come in handy because you're trying to optimize for different outcomes and figure out what the best outcome is going to be.
Yeah.
So that's a math skill that I would recommend. If you're going to be doing it, sometimes it depends on what you're interested in. If you're really interested in geospatial analysis, then something like trigonometry is going to be incredibly important to you,
Mm.
because you're going to be dealing with a lot of angles and calculating differences between angles and stuff like that. Um, uh, Probability is very closely aligned with statistics, but it's worth its own independent look. Think about probability in a couple different lights. Think about, kind of the standard classical probability. Think about Bayesian probabilities, because all of those things are important, and they're all tools in the toolkit. You don't use them
Mhm.
all the time. In fact, sometimes I don't pull on things that I've learned that I've thought about in a decade, and all of a sudden it becomes important. So it's good to have that background knowledge out there. There's always discussions on calculus, whether that's important or not. I
Mm.
think understanding the concepts is really important. I think necessarily doing the calculations, being able to do them by hand, much less so at this point. But understanding what is the math doing, how am I calculating this area under the curve and why is it important? Those things are important.
Yeah, yeah, no, that makes sense. That's what I've heard before is like it's really important to kind of understand it because some of those like algorithms I'll look at and I'll just like my eyes will blur over, I'll see Greek, but like kind of knowing what it does though, like, I think is the most important thing.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just to build off of that, I've done the same thing where I've looked at I wanted to understand more about something, and the first thing I did was pull out a textbook. Like this was
Mhm.
something way deep into regression analysis theory, and I pulled out a textbook, and all of a sudden I'm looking at this long page of equations, and I'm like, okay, this is not going to get me where I need to be.
Yeah.
Um, I went out on YouTube and Googled or just searched for the subject and found somebody really great at explaining it.
Mhm.
And I tend to listen, like when I'm learning something like that, I tend to listen to a couple different voices. Like if I look at one YouTube video, I want to look at another one and see if that person says the same thing.
Mm.
Or are they gonna, tell me that purple is green, because they've got a different, because we all have different sets of facts now. It's entirely. I like to triangulate and make sure that I'm kind of getting to the middle of what various people are saying, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I also realized along the way that I'm an auditory learner as well. I assume maybe you are also. And that was a big thing for me was transitioning from just kind of reading things to actually like even having automated text to speech or whatever. Like even that was like better and easier for me to follow. But yeah, I think that's a great tip of kind of rethinking, how you learn some of these things that are a little hard to get a grasp on.
Hmm.
Yeah, we also got a question about in terms of like entry level data analytics roles. I know that's kind of how you got started in the field. And you also have some background data visualization as well. But do you have any tips for kind of, tools that people should look to build skills in when they're trying to enter the field via that direction?
Yeah, I think that, SQL is obviously, the biggest one to do there. Inside of data visualization, this is again where you're going to get really specific on the company. Are they using Tableau? Are they using Power BI? Are they using Looker? These are things that are going to change depending on what company you're at. So you want your skill set to be as varied and as generalizable as you can get.
Mm,
This is an area where I would say learn Tableau. If you're trying to like get into a data
yeah.
visualization role, SQL and Tableau are going to be a really, really great stack. Tableau may not be the best tool to use for business intelligence across the board.
Mm,
It's a really, really, really great analyst tool, and it's incredibly widely deployed. And so you've got this huge addressable market of companies that you can work at because so many people use Tableau. And then you've got this really great tool in front of you that you can create really cool stuff in. And the best thing about Tableau is that it's like this desktop software-based thing. So what you can do is you can package it up. You can create something really cool, and you can package it up and send it to a hiring manager and say, "Hey, look at this really cool thing that I did." Because that's another piece of advice that I want to give everybody is if you're proactively reaching out to a hiring manager on LinkedIn, don't ask for a job
mm,
because that's a really easy way to get your email ignored. Is hey, here's my profile. Tell me if you have any jobs that are a good fit for me. Okay, that's not
mm,
helpful. Um, uh, what's helpful is when you do the research and you find out, you can go out on my website and see that I have two roles open right now. You come back and say, hey, I think I'm a really great fit for this senior manager of BI role
mm,
because of this, this, and this. And you send me an attachment of like a Tableau dashboard that you built that's just really cool. It could be about anything. It could be about the weather, about COVID, about cryptocurrency, about whatever topic is at the top of your mind. And you send me this thing, and I look at this and I'm like, oh, this is the type of thing I want to put in front of my users. I better talk to this
mm.
person. Like that's a way of doing effective outreach to a hiring manager. And you're showing me that you've got the skills that I need in order to do the job.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a SQL type language that you also use within Tableau, right? That kind of go hand in hand.
So I haven't looked at Tableau in a couple years. I don't know if they have a new language that is like an overlay. And there's a Tableau scripting language. I know that. And then you would interact with databases via SQL as well. And I don't know if
Mm,
there's a third way or a new way or another way.
yeah.
It's something. quite frankly, I need to look into this year as an enterprise solution, but it's not it's not the top of my mind right now.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think those are great skills, though. Those are definitely ones to work on. But yeah, so I also wanted to kind of jump back to, talk about, your kind of career progression and going from an analyst to a manager. And you said that you kind of built up that team from scratch, right? Kind of,
Helped. Yeah. I helped.
uh,
So didn't do it all by myself, but I definitely helped. Yeah.
yeah. So how did like your job responsibilities change with that? And like, what did you kind of learn along the way as you sought more people to join your team?
Yeah, so really, really interesting question, and it dovetails on a podcast that I listened to over the weekend. So I don't know if anybody listens to Freakonomics Radio, but they did an episode last week about the Peter Principle.
Mm,
And the Peter Principle, most tongue in cheek, you rise to the level of your incompetence. But in reality, what it means is um, managers tend to choose the best individual contributor on their team to move into management roles, whether or not that person's going to make a good manager. A data science manager is very different from being a data scientist. Two entirely different worlds. And so when I went into management, it was the last role that I had at Apple. Um, I had had a really specific conversation with my boss about what I wanted out of my career, and we talked about trade-offs. If you go into management, you don't do as much technical work, and I'm really good at the technical work. That's how I built my whole career is building cool stuff for people, and I don't do that. But what I learned about myself is I'm happiest when I'm making something. So whether that's a data
mm,
product or a team, but where I found I was really happiest was when I was making new data scientists, when I was,
mm,
taking I had met this guy who worked in one of the Apple retail stores who had a little bit of statistical knowledge from his undergraduate. He had a tiny little bit of programming experience, just enough that he wasn't starting at completely zero. And I brought him in for this temporary assignment into our offices in Cupertino, and spent like 6 months with him, just teaching him how to be a data scientist, teaching him how to ask the questions. Of course, there's all the technical components and motions of getting the data, analyzing the data, summarizing it, getting it out to people. But then teaching him how to ask the questions of the data that
mhm,
set him apart from, the regular analyst, and
mhm.
to someone who could really show up and add value to an organization. Like that's why I ultimately went into leadership, is because doing that was so much fun. The other thing for me was I like knowing everything, and so being able to see what everybody's doing and how all the pieces are interconnected. That's also a very interesting exercise to me.
Yeah, so it's a lot more, I guess, working with people than just the data, right? Is that
Oh,
become
that's
majority?
all I do all day long is work with
Mm,
people. Like the most advanced tool that I use every day is Slack or my inbox. Actually, the most advanced tool is my calendar.
yeah.
And that's the most limited resource.
Mhm,
But literally today, like you think about a typical day of a data scientist, hopefully most of the day your fingers are moving. For me, most of the day my mouth is moving.
hmm.
And that's the really, really big difference.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And by the way, we have time for like two or three more questions. So if you guys have any more pressing questions, feel free to drop those in the chat now. But we have another from Pavan about how important are certifications for you when you're looking at candidates to hire? Is that like a big green check mark?
Nope,
No.
nope,
Ooh, okay.
nope. No, I mean I'm not opposed to certifications. I don't really look or care or anything like that. I don't know what certifications in the data space are useful here.
Hmm.
Like I don't know. Like I did two certifications early on in SaaS. I did the base certification, the advanced certification.
Hmm.
I don't think that it ever really got me anything. It might have gotten me an interview or two, but then you've got to be able to back it up and show your skills for real. Nobody's going to take, hey, I've got this certification. I know the skills as an answer. I'm going to want to see how you've applied and how you can demonstrate that you actually have those skills to me. So one of the things, and one of the reasons I say that is one of the things that I started doing a couple of years ago, and I didn't do this for the longest time, was I started to do a technical assessment on SQL, just a real simple programming test,
Mm.
because I was shocked at the number of people that would tell me they knew they were an 8 or 9 in SQL. And then I get the results of the test back, and it's like, well, you scored a 22% on this. Um, and I found that there's a big mismatch between what people say they can do and what they can actually do.
Hmm.
And so for me, I like to see those skills demonstrated, kind of directly, not through a certification, not necessarily through something. Oh, I took this test and I took this class on Coursera. It's like, okay, that's cute. Prove to me that you know it. Anybody can sit through a class.
Yeah.
Anybody can pass a certification test. With enough time and effort. Some people are really good test takers. Some people are not. I have a really deep knowledge in a lot of subjects that I could probably not pass a test on because I'm a
Mm.
terrible test taker.
Yeah, yeah. So if you're looking at like the ideal kind of like entry level resume, would you like to see kind of more projects on there versus certifications or, other
Yep.
such?
Yep. Projects. I want to see Kaggle competitions. I want to see
Mhm.
a portfolio of work. If I can look at code and see that you know how to code, that's not the same templated stuff that I see from everybody else. If you show me that you've built this really cool thing that hits this API, that when you put in this information, you get this prediction back, like that's
Yeah,
something pretty cool. I want to see that as a hiring manager. What I don't want to see, I think my doorbell just rang.
yeah.
Um, what I don't want to see, I think my microwave shocked me the other day, and I think it's the man to come look at it. What I don't want to see is the same thing over and over again, the copy and pasted. As much as I love it, I don't want to see your
Mm.
Titanic logistic regression model.
Oh yeah.
I've seen it a million times. I love it. It's my favorite baby's first model.
Mm.
But I don't want to see it as a hiring manager because it's not going to tell me anything other than you Googled some tutorial and told you how to fit the Titanic logistic regression to the Titanic data set.
Yeah, and that makes sense. You want to see like that intellectual curiosity we talked about, right?
Yep, and that's actually the answer to Pavan's next question. What impresses a hiring manager during interviewing? That curiosity. If you show me that you care, you're curious, you're passionate,
Mm.
like I know how hard you're going to work to solve a problem based off of that alone. And those traits together will ameliorate deficiencies on the technical side
Mm.
because that helps me to understand that you know how to learn, you know how to teach yourself, and you're so curious that you're not going to let those skills get past you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think that's actually a great note to end on. I know you probably have someone at the door you got to get to, but this has been great. This has been so helpful. I think there's a lot of great tips here. And if anyone wants to review this will be on our YouTube channel, so you can feel free to go back and rewatch. And also, if this was helpful, leave us a like on our page so you can view our next events. And feel free to reach out to Matt. I don't know, I'm volunteering that, but
Yep,
he's linked on there as well if there's any additional questions. And I also am aware you're hiring, right? You have some open roles.
I
Um,
am.
but yeah, well,
Yep.
thank you.
So
Oh, go ahead.
yeah. So real quick, let me just plug it since I got a
Yeah.
chance. Main thing I'm looking for right now, senior manager for business intelligence. Specifically, if you know how to run Looker, I would love to talk to you. Reach out.
Great. Well, that's a great opportunity right there. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Matt. And thank you, everyone else, for joining us tonight. And we'll see you next week.